and reading some stuff, and this get or create is a wonderful way to allow yourself to do many-to-one relationships and make sure that you're not doing vertical replication in a column. So the get or create is kind of really doing almost all the work for us with the vertical replication.
Our next topic is to talk about log in and log out. Now, just in general, I have this GitHub repository called DJ Free Samples, and every once in a while you ought to see if I've found some bugs and fixed them. So go over to your samples and do a git pull. So every once in a while, just do that. So Django, like in lots of situations, comes with a built-in log-in, log-out system. There's lots of ways to do it. You can read up on it. It has a way to create users, has this nice admin interface. And so one of the things we like about Django is that we don't have to build some of these basic maintenance things. It has permissions and groups. We use this in the local library application, but we're not going to use that so much in our applications. And passwords, etc. And it has a way to store these things in various techniques. And so the first thing that you'll probably encounter when you're doing this is to create a super user. And so you have to log into your system, you create a super user, give it a name, an email address. The email address is for password recovery, even though you can log in and you can change your super user password anywhere. And then you do it. Now there's a great XKCD cartoon for so many things. This is, one guy says, make me a sandwich, and the other one says, what? Make it yourself? And then says, sudo, make me a sandwich. And the other person says, okay. So what sudo means is it's a Linux command to switch to the super user and do a command. So if you don't have permissions to do a command, you can say sudo a command. And so that's what this XKCD. So that's what we call a super user. That's the user that has all permissions, doesn't need to get any special permissions. This might be a good time to review what you're going to do when you wipe out your database. When you create that super user, it just adds a row into a table in your DB SQLite, and you can wipe this out anytime. That's why I like using SQLite for development in Django. If you remove it, you've removed all the tables, all of the tables created by migrations. The migrate command is what creates tables. The make migration actually creates migrations with your Python code. So if you're going to start fresh, you got to remove the DB SQLite file. That's got rid of all your users, all your super users, any data you put in, it's gone. And then you have to wake it back up with a bunch of empty tables with a manage.py migrate, and you'll see all those things. Lots of lines come out at that point. I didn't include them. And then you're going to have to create your super users again. So just if you wipe your database, you got to recreate your super users. Once you have a super user, the rest of the users are put in using the admin interface. You just go in and among all the other models that you might have in your application, the groups and the users are just models. They're models that happen to be built into Django, and you don't have any responsibility for building them. And so, like I said, the groups and permissions is useful, and you can read up on that, and maybe your application needs to use those. But for me, I pretty much just make users and call it good. Later, we're going to learn how to use like social login. So we'll use GitHub to log people in, so you don't have to create any users other than your admin user. But in the short term, we're just going to use what are called local users, which are stuck in the database, kept in the database, and easy to create, easy to maintain, but you tend to have to manually maintain them a little bit. So next we're going to look at, now that you've got a user, how do we in our application code log in and log out users. So now we're going to take a look at what we do with Django to handle logging users into and out of our application. So we talked about sessions recently, and making a session is not the same as being logged in. Logging in actually changes data in the session. Logging in general, the most basic way of logging in depends on the existence of a session, and logging in is putting data into the session about the current user and their name and their email, and then logging out is removing it. In the session, you could have multiple users. Log in with one user, log out. Log in with a different user, log out. If you're just in the same browser, you're going to end up with the same session, just associated with different users. So remember, Sessions and login are not the same thing. Just like cookies and sessions are not the same thing, sessions and login are not the same thing. But they all build on each other. Sessions build on cookies and login builds on sessions. So to make this all work, you have to add to your installed apps all the Django support for all this login and logout stuff. Now, if you automatically built your project and you got a settings.py that they're going to just put this in automatically. So this is just so you know when you're looking at it where it is that all this magic functionality comes from. It comes from this installed apps. Also for the login and logout, you're going to have to add a path to your project-wide. So DJ for eSamples, DJ for eSamples, urls.py. This is not in any of your applications. This is in your Django project. And you add a path, and there's a bunch of URLs, and that gets all registered, and a whole bunch of wonderful magic happens at that point. And so that's how these URLs are activated in your Django project, so the applications. So the way we get the URLs to the login and logout features is we use the reverse. We've been using reverse all along. Reverse is the way we look up for a particular view. And in some urls.py, matter of fact, in that Django contrib auth URLs, in that there is a name equals. And so there's a view in there that they've got that we didn't write, and it has a name equals, and it has name equals login and a name equals logout. And so we can do a reverse lookup like we would of any of our views that we might have. Say, give me the URL in this Django project for the view named login or the view named logout. And it's pretty simple. You could even probably hard code these, but maybe the route isn't exactly account /, right? And so maybe you called them something else. And so that's why we use the reverse to look these things up. And so that's just a convenient way of doing it. Now, one of the things about logging in is sometimes you have an application and there's like a login button. But sometimes you just have pages that are protected by login. And then when you go to a page, it says, oh wait, you got to log in first. And then after you log in, you'll notice it typically just takes you right back to the page that you wanted to see. So you might bookmark a page when you're logged in, and then you log out, and then you click on that bookmark page, but that requires that you be logged in. So you're going to go to the page, and then when you're done logging in, you want to come right back to that page. And so that's using redirecting, but it's redirecting after login is successful or after logout is successful. Logouts are almost always successful. And so there's a parameter that we can add, a get parameter that we can add, and it's the next equals, and what we do is we give it a path. And so here's a little bit of code that we're going to play with in my sample codes under the authz project, under the authz application. And so I got a bunch of views, and I'm going to give them some names so that we can play with them. So these are just the urls.py. So if you take a look in this main.html template, you see a whole bunch of things. You see this next feature in action. So here's a couple things we can do. So there is this user object that in a sense is passed in. You don't have to do anything to pass it in. There's this user object that sits there in your template context that's automatically. We'll talk later about how you can sort of inject into every template certain little things that you got to inject. But the system injects this user. There is an attribute called isAuthenticated, which is true or false, to say whether you're not logged in or are logged in. And so if we see it, we say, oh, what's their person's full name, user.email, user.id. User ID is the primary key. We might actually have later we'll have a foreign key that goes into the user table, and we need to know what the primary key of the current user is so we can populate our foreign key. So when we have a row and it's owned by such and so, we're going to actually put a foreign key into a table that we didn't even create. But the thing I'm talking about now is you can get a URL, that URL tag that's looking up a name of a view. Log out is the name of a view. Log in is the name of a view. And then we have this question mark next equals. That's the parameter to say when you're all done with that login or log out, go back to this particular URL. Okay? And so that says go to the URL that's in the authz application, the view named open. And so that's one way of doing it. Another way, let's say in login, we're going to get the login URL and send ourselves back to the request path. The request is another one of these things that's dropped in automatically for us. that is the current URL of the view we're at. So in a sense, this is a contraction that says, go ahead and go to login, and when you're back, come right back here. So login will log in and then redirect back to this page that we're on, whatever the page is, because this is going to be, this little main.html is used in a couple of my different views. So request.path is like, come back here. So that's a good pattern to know, to just say log in and come back to this current path when you're all done. And so here's just a bunch of connections to this thing, and we have here's just all my links, and I have a couple of things. I have some no login required pages just to play around, and then I have one that's protected by hand in Python, and then one's required by a login mixin, and then I sort of dump all that data, and I think I showed you that one already. So here is one of them, right? I showed that. That's what this all looks like. You can see that these links have the next in there. This is how it turns out to be. You get accounts login. Oops, come back. You go to accounts login, next equals auth open, and that's basically, I'm in this file right now. I'm in that URL, and that says go ahead and log me in, and then come back to this URL, to the auth open. Here's an example of the logout URL with a next setup in it. And so up next, we're going to talk about not just how to get the users to go to the login page, but how to configure the login page. So now we've kind of understood a little bit about the user object and how we do things in templates, and how we get at the URLs for login and logout, and then how we redirect back to ourselves. Let's talk a little bit about the login page itself. And so the login page is something that's provided by Django, but it needs a template. And so what happens is we get to control the template. And we're going to go to this URL, the code behind the views, the code that looks up the password, the code that gives you errors. That's all taken care of. All the views are taken care of. And what we get to do is we get to describe a template that controls our look and feel. And so we can have a simple login thing or a pretty login thing, and we can have links to the rest of our application. And so we want control over our login page so it looks like it comes from our application rather than having it look like it came from Django. So I'm not going to go through in much detail about how this works. You have to create a template that can be accessed as registration/login.html. And remember that no matter which application in a Django project you're working in, those names are global. So for example, this name right here, registration login.html, the fact that it's in my home application doesn't matter. And that's why we have this extra slash in here. So just because it's in the home application doesn't mean it has to be, the home and the registration don't have to be the same in this particular case. And so this is a template that if they just do a render, so in their view, in the login view that's somewhere deep in Django, they're just going to do a render to registration/login.html. You have this somewhere in some application because the templates are global. It's going to find your template and put that in. So within this template, there's a few rules that you've got to follow. They're going to send some errors, and there's errors. If the form has errors, you have to have some output that deals with that. If next, that's actually that next equals parameter. Okay, and so if the next is there, and you've come into this log, and this one's a little bit weird. If you have a going forward page, that means you came from a page and you're going to go back to a page. If the authentication happens, that means you've been logged in, you went to the page kicked you back because it's protected by more than just logged in user. Okay, so this little bit right here, this is a little bit subtle. If you're not logged in, that's kind of the normal case. Please log in to see the site. And then we basically create a simple form. We're going to post to the login URL. That just looks up the login URL. And we've got this context variable called form, and we can print that out. That form has the key, that form has all of the input stuff in it. We're going to talk about forms coming up soon. And so that's what generates this form here. Generates all this stuff right here, and so there could be a bunch of things in there, but the form is a variable created by the view that has all the input names and areas, etc., that it wants. So we didn't have to actually construct the form. We do have to submit, put the login button, we could put a cancel button, and we do have to pass the next back as a hidden field. Now, a hidden form field is just like a text field, except that it doesn't show up here. And so that's in there, and if you were to view source, you would see that. And so that's after you submit this form, it needs to know where we're going to go next. So then if you're successfully logged in, it's going to log you in, say yay, and then it's going to redirect to whatever that next value is. And that's our way of, it's going to give us the next value inside this template, but we have to give it back to the view when we post back into the view. So like I mentioned, there's a whole bunch of data that we can get. There is this user variable, and that user variable has their full name, their email, and very importantly, the primary key of the logged in user. But these things are only defined if user is authenticated is true. You can access this user data in Python. It's in a little different spot. It's in the request. So this, I just changed the name of request to REQ. That's just a variable name you pick. I will generally always write it as request or REQ. And so the user information, that is pretty much the same as what's in the template tag, template context user. User is authenticated, their username, their email. I could have had rec.user.id if I wanted here, and otherwise it's not logged in, and then I just throw this back as a simple HTTP response. This isn't all that useful. It's just showing you how to get your hands on those values if you're in Python. So sometimes you're in Python, sometimes you're in templates. Quite commonly you're in templates. So I've been talking about a view that requires a logged in user. And so again, imagine something where you're sort of reading your messages on an online system, and you bookmark the message reading URL, and then you shut your browser down, which logs you out of the system, and then you click on that bookmark straight to the messages, my inbox or whatever, and then inbox looks at you and says, you're not logged in. So I got to send you to log in, you finish logging in, and then you come back. That's what the next equals does. Now there's a couple of ways in views to write that kind of feature that basically says, this view is fine, but only fine for logged in users. So let's take a look. So one of them is checking to see if user is authenticated. So I have two views in here. One is, I'm going to protect it manually, and that's so you can see how it works, but it's really not the right way to do it. I mean, you can do it this way, but it's like, there's always a better way in Django, always a better way in Django. So here we have a class-based view, and we ask, is the user authenticated? If the user is authenticated, we just do whatever. Now, there might be a whole bunch of stuff in here. There might be a whole bunch of, but I'm just going to render the thing so that's a view. So I'm protecting this particular manual protect view. But if you're authenticated, you can see it, right? It doesn't do anything in particular other than dump a bunch of data out. If you're not authenticated, then I'm going to construct a login URL by calling reverse, say look up the URL for login, add a question mark, and then add the request path, which means wherever we're at, come back to it. So that's the next, and that's going to put next equals, blah, 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 blah. And then instead of returning a render, we return a redirect and say, okay, go to the login URL. So the way this is going to work is, it's going to come in once, right? You're not logged in, so it's redirecting. It's going to go out, but then it's going to come in back again, and this time the user is redirected in, so it's going to show you the page. So you end up going through this twice. Now, that's the bad way to do it, or the wordy way to do it. I mean, it's only 5 lines of code, but I don't like 5 lines of code. So there's this thing called a mixin, and a mixin is a class. The idea of a mixin is that, we have kind of an inherited class. We inherit things that are like just a feature almost. So what we're doing is we're going to take our protect view. It really extends a view, but it's going to also add the capabilities of login required mixin. So login required mixin basically says to Django, if this is here, hey, I want to do this. Don't let the user into this particular view. Protect the view. So this is another protected view, but by simply including this little signal that says login required mixin, I've mixed this into my view, then it does all this work for us. So what'll happen is, it won't even come in, right? It won't even come in if the user's not logged in. It will redirect and then come back and then let this code in the get run only when the user's logged in. And so this is by far the most common way to do it, is just called login required mixin, saving you from writing all these lines of code, right? So all these extra things, because do I remember how to do this? What if I write that 5,000 times in an application? It's really kind of silly when we've got login required mixin that takes care of all this stuff. And just to review, this is what that view looks like. It just sort of dumps all that stuff out. I use the same I use the same template for all of these views. So login, like many things in Django, is simple. It's easy. You add the things to installed apps and URL patterns. You make yourself a template. I didn't go into great detail. Django has great documentation if you want to get really sophisticated. What I tend to do is I get 1 or 2 templates working for login. I'm like, I want to use this one today or that one. So this is where like the sample code has 2 different logins that we're going to use. One is a simple local login, and the other one actually is a login when we're going to use GitHub to do our logins. You can get yourself you get your URLs for login with reverse lazy, or the URL template tag. And then if we want to come back, we add an X parameter to those URLs. And then when we have a view and we say, look, this view is going to depend on request.user or the user in the user template tag, just add login required mixin, and then Django takes care of making sure that you can't get to the view unless you're logged in. And if you try to get to the view, it tries to let you log in. And if you are login successful, you come back to the view, and it's all transparent to you. And it's literally just one little comma thing in the create. So it's pretty simple. It's pretty awesome. I just want you to understand what's going on, because again, sometimes the fewer the lines of code to write, the harder it is to understand. Cheers. So up to now, we've mostly just talked about how forms work. We've been talking about how forms work across whatever programming language you're using or framework you're using. We've mostly talked about how the browsers treat forms, how we generate HTML to make forms, how posts work, how refresh works, how post redirect works, how CSRF works. That's, other than subtle details, those are topics that are true no matter what you do, no matter what language you're writing in or what framework that you're using. Now we're going to pivot a little bit and talk about how Django helps you do all those things that we just got done talking about doing. So if you look at this picture, you see that like forms are kind of in the middle of this picture. That's the final piece we're filling in. And forms are connected a lot of ways. Forms can be connected to models. They're used in the view and they're used in templates. And so they're a very powerful part. And all the things that we've been doing as abstractions, where we write a little bit of code and find lots of ways to reuse that code. Or we write some code that extends an object, and then we add a little bit to it, and then we've got some very powerful object when we're all said and done. And so that's what we're doing here in forms. And forms can be used in views, they can be used in templates, and they can interact even with models. And so we're going to talk a lot about forms. There's a lot of like just menial labor that just working in forms, and if you really had to build all the HTML from scratch like I did in some of those earlier examples, it's just really painful. And there's other problems too, and that is that there's just a lot of repeating yourself. We kind of want to use like object-oriented techniques and other techniques to not repeat ourselves. And it's really easy to put the HTML up for a crappy form, but why wouldn't you want a beautiful form? And so if you write the HTML and you write some CSS and you do a kind of crappy version of it, then you have to fix it or hand it to a designer, and then they have to go fix 100 pages. There are things in Django, Crispy Forms is something we'll talk about later, that just like says, hey, I'm using forms in Django. Wait a sec, I want them to be pretty now. And then you just make them pretty. And if you want to change how they're pretty, you can change how that works. And then you change them all at the same time. And so not repeating yourself, being able to like lean on utility code. Seems like, why would we do this? But in complex applications, you just fall in love with this idea that you don't have to repeat yourself. And even though I've showed you some of the things like post, redirect, refresh, CSRF, all that stuff, it's even more complex than that, especially when you start talking about pulling data from the database and putting it in an edit form and then checking to see if the data is valid. If the data is not valid, send back an error form and give them a chance to resubmit it. If they're successful, you do post redirect and then you send a message in the session. We've done all that in really simple, but if you really look at everything that you need to look at, it's pretty complex. And so we're not going to do all this in this first lecture, but this gives you a sense of the kinds of things that a create form, where you're going to go like, new cat, and then you got some forms to fill out, fields to fill out about the cat, and then you hit the save. And so if we just go through this, these are the steps you need to do to insert a cat in your cat database, right? So your browser initially goes and gets a GET request, and then you fill out the empty form with a bunch of fill in the blank fields. The user can always cancel out of that and get out. The user might enter some data and hit post. Now the problem is, what if you have some rules about the data, such as this is required, that has to be at least 5 characters, etc. You have to then send a form back with that data to let them fix it and resubmit it again. Or if it's good, you go ahead and store the data in the database, but then we have to put some kind of a success message, like in a session or something, and then send a redirect out, and then the browser immediately comes back and gets the redirect URL, which pulls the message out, sends the page, and sends the success. And so we've done parts of this already, right? We've done parts of this already. The big part we haven't done is kind of like this middle part here, where we're like validating the data and have this error retry loop that we put the user back in the loop and give them another chance. Now that's the create form. The edit process, where you're pulling in an existing cat and you're going to edit their fields, is even more complex. You go load up a cat, but you might have an error page because they're looking for a cat that didn't exist in our database. You send out the form with the old data. They might leave. They might edit it. They might come back. They might validate the data and get an error. Then they have to fix the data. They got to go around here until, okay, we got some valid data, and then you store the data in the database, put a message in a session, send out a redirect to a success URL, and that success URL, you put out the message and say yay. So that's complex too, and we're going to figure that out. Delete is not as simple as you might seem. The problem with deleting things is that you can't delete with a GET request. So usually you have to go navigate, like you see a little delete button, you click on it and you go to a delete page. It's going to load the data that you want to delete, so you can build a confirmation page. Confirmation pages turn out to be really important because they're also our tricky way to convert a GET to a post. But if they're asking for the wrong data, we have to send an error message. Otherwise, we send a confirmation form that says, are you sure you want to delete this? That's both nice for the user to give a confirmation, but it also then turns this into a form. And of course, they can leave with a cancel, but if they click on yes, that turns into a post, and it has the key. So the first thing it does is it has to load the data again from the model. And then if that data is not there, they got the wrong key, then you send an error page out. And if you got the right key and the user has permission to delete the data, then you go talk to the model and you delete the thing, right? Then you put a congratulations on your deletion in a session or something. Then go with a redirect, because you can't respond with a 200. You got to respond with a 302. And then the browser immediately does a get a success URL, pulls the message out of session, makes a success page with the message. Now we're going to cover this a bunch of times, so you don't have to get this the first time. But I just am telling you that forms are complex. And what's cool is Django form objects that we're going to create act like glue. They can generate the HTML, they allow for a consistent look and feel, and they allow for you to change the look and feel. When the post data comes back from the browser in a form that it created, then it puts it all in the right spot. It validates the data based on a set of rules that you say, like this has to be this kind of a thing and that kind of a thing, or a date or a character or an integer or a floating point. Whatever it is the rules are, that's all done for you in Django. And if something goes wrong, then it hands you an error form that you can send right back to the user. It really greatly, and then of course, once it's validated, it moves it into a model, and then actually can even do the database store automatically. So the form is like this glue thing that sort of talks to templates, it talks to browsers, it reads data from browsers, it's like stuff in. And so in a way, the form is like the controller, it's like the view, it just makes your views really succinct, and you're gonna love it once you understand it. So here is a simple form, and so forms live in a file called forms.py, not surprisingly. And basically, just like them, it looks a lot like the models file. And so you're going to see the one thing that forms do differently is they can have these things called validators. Models have rules about max length, etc. But there are even more complex validators, and you can even write code that you have your own functions that when the form is coming in, you're going to look at this one field and you're going to say like, oh, I wanted 2 uppercase characters followed by 3 lowercase characters. Sorry, you didn't do what I said. That's what's called a validator. And that's when that error page goes back and it says, hey, you're missing this stuff. And we'll show you how the validator stuff works. But basically, you put in little lines just like you did for the model. And you're effectively defining a user interface plus a bunch of logic behind it. Now, the one thing I'm not doing in this particular section, we'll do soon, is connecting this to a model. So you could say, wait a sec, I'd like to make a form and I really mostly want to inherit from a model. You can do that, but that's not this one. That's coming up in the whole next section, but it won't be long. So the form object, right? So here's this form we just made. It's got 3 fields in it. And this is a real simple view. It's not useful. It just kind of shows you one of the things you can do. So make a basic form. When the basic form is defined as having these 3 fields, and then you say form and then call the method as table. And so what this produces, it's just a dump. There's nothing, the UI of this looks really ugly. But basically it generates all this HTML for you, all this HTML, input tags, and we told it to do it as table. That's not necessarily the prettiest way to do it, but all that HTML is generated from the form utility. So it can send it out as a list, you can send it out as paragraphs, etc., etc., etc. And so this is just to show you kind of the dump. If you go to this URL, do a view source on it so you see this stuff in here. So that you define a form object, and one of the things you can do is make me HTML. And this is not a good example. We'll come up in a bit with a better example. The better example, of course, is to use it in a template. And so here is a template with a simple form in it. We got a form, it's a post. We got some submit stuff. We got ourselves a cancel, button that we put in. And we got a CSRF token. And we're going to use that form as table. And we're going to surround it by a table tag so that it looks a lot prettier. And so this is a far more typical way of doing it. That first one was just to dump it. And so when you do this and you give it, you sort of make the form in a get request. You make the form and you pass it into the context. If you remember, form.asTable. That's a very, come back. Too far. Form.asTable came from the context, came from the passed in variable, and that is right here and right here. And so we make the form object, which has all the fields in it, and then we pass it into our view, our template, and it renders that. And so then this is what it looks like, much prettier. And if you do a view source of that, if you go to this form create and you do a view source on that, you'll see it's all that same table stuff. It's the same table stuff that we had before. It's just now wrapped in some stuff to make it look a little prettier. We put a submit button, it's got a form tag, and then you can actually hit the submit button and something actually happens. So this is by far the more typical way of using a form in a template. So I talked about the create form, the update form, and the delete form. This is kind of an example of how forms can be used. Now, I'm not actually talking to the model yet. We'll do that in a bit. So I'm just going to pretend that we have some old data. And so this normally would come from the model. This old data, title, mileage, purchase date, that would come from the model normally. But for now, we're just going to make it up. And so then you basically start a form and you pass this old data in as the constructor. That's a constructor for a basic form. From the basic form class, pass in old data and give me back the form. Give me back an object of type basic form, and I'm going to have it in the variable form, and then I'm going to pass it into context. Now you'll notice I'm using the exact same template, the one I showed you before, because that form as table understands that sometimes there's data in these fields, and it properly puts the data in. It properly escapes the data. It understands that this is a number. It understands that this is a date. It's got all that stuff all figured out, right? And so this is how it works, is you just somehow get your hands on key value pairs of the old data, you pass it into the constructor, and now you render the form, and the forms library takes care of putting in all that old data. Believe you me, you're probably glad I'm not showing you how to do, HTML and code and all these things, and when you do encode, but this is a little different because it's inside of an attribute. You don't want to know that because you just are going to use form as table, and it's got all the rules figured out. This is hundreds of lines of code that you're not writing. So up next, we're going to talk about the validation part. So that's actually what happens when we receive data back from the browser. Hello and welcome to another Django for Everybody walkthrough. So you are probably at this point working on your autos assignment. This is our first real create, read, update, and delete assignment. And we're going to, a lot of what this assignment is to look at the code I've given you in DJ Free Samples and pull it in. Do not clone the repository for this assignment. The DJ Free Samples is a monster. It's got all kinds of stuff in it that's way too complex, and you want to start with a nice clean application. Your previous assignment was to make a really tiny application. Now we're going to extend that application, and that's why you've already have this DJ Free projects in your wherever it is, okay? And so what this is this assignment is to evolve that using the sample code. But what I'm really going to do is I'm going to walk through the sample code because there's new concepts in this sample code. So this is more of a lecture about the sample code than exactly how to do the assignment. But importantly, you need to understand every single line, because literally every program that we're going to write for the next N weeks is a variation on this CRUD, right? And so these views, these default views, the get or 404, all that stuff are really foundational things. And what we're going to find is the right way to write this code, like everything in Django, is really small and succinct. Okay? So let's take a look at the code. Let's go ahead and run the code. Go to autos, and you got to log in. And so the idea of this is there are two tables. There is a table of makes. So I'm going to add a make, and then I'm going to add an auto. And the cool thing about this is neon 1, mileage 1234, Sakai car, and then I have this cool drop down. And so this is there's a whole bunch of forms going on here. There's drop downs. There's a many-to-one relationship going on. Then I have this list, and I can update it and delete it. So that's where our full CRUD is. And so we can add makes, view makes, add autos, etc. And so that's all the sample. So it's very close to what it is that you have to write. It's just don't go grabbing all that stuff. So let's start by taking a look. So I'm here sitting in my DJ Free Samples. And if you look, you see all of my various applications under a project. And so we've got the autos. But I really want to start with the authentication code. The code that, if I go here, back to samples, let me log out, the code that allows me to log in. So if I go straight to autos, see if I've logged out. Right, so you'll notice that what it does when I go straight to autos is it routes me to login, and then with the next to go back to autos. So this view in autos, the /autos, has protected itself with login mixin. And later we'll do login. Your login won't quite look like this, but this is the one I have on samples, where you don't have to make it pretty yet. An upcoming assignment is going to make everything pretty. So now we're at autos and we're logged in. Okay, and your application has to have some more things here, but I'm more interested in showing you really the essence of the views in this autos, right? So if let's just review just briefly. Let's just review briefly about how the auto login works, right? So if I look at DJ Free Samples /settings.py, you need to have this auth plugged in, right? So that basically that's a bunch of code, some views, etc. that comes from Django, and that's been there all along when you did your start project. Of course, then somewhere in here we've got to have the autos, wherever autos is. Yeah, autos app config. You get to pull the autos app in. And if I take a look at djfreesample/urls.py, then I can find autos here, and there needs to be some kind of a link that basically says at the top level, everything below autos is delegated to the URLs file in autos.py. But also then there is the accounts, right? And so if you recall, this is a bunch of views that come from Django for us. It's pre-installed for us. And the thing that we've got to do is we've got to build we've got to provide this a template with the name registration.html. So I think I've got this in home/templates registration. Yes, I do. So I've got actually two logins. I've got a really simple one is login.html, and this is the one I recommend that you start with. Later we'll use the social login. And this is very simple. It's a login page. It uses the Django Forms capability. If form.errors, that means that there was a validation error and it came back and redisplayed this page and showed you an error. And then we make a simple post form with a URL that is a reverse lookup to a view with the name of login. Then we put the CSRF token in, and then we take the form, and I'm just making this with paragraph tags. And so that's a simple login. That's not the actual one that we're showing. And then the next is a hidden value that you've got to pass in so that when you actually successfully log in, it knows to come back to autos when it's all done. It come back here after the login has been done. And so that registration/login, you can put this in any of your applications, but you want to name it registration/login.html. So if I take a look real quick and I go into home templates, these are all the templates. When I do an ls, you'll see that I have a home templates home and a home templates registration. You can have more than one folder here. And if I do look at what's in registration, you see that I've got this simple login and then later the more complex login that will give us the GitHub login capabilities. So we can log in using, what that means is log in use social. The point is underneath this templates, you don't have to just have one subfolder. You can have more than one subfolders. And so that is the necessary configuration to make it so that when we tell our views to add the login mixin, which we'll see in just a second, when we tell our views in the login to use the login mixin, then it knows where to get the template from. So that's just part of it. And your instructions tell you how to do that. So any application that you're going to build or any project you're going to build, you have to put those in settings.py, urls.py, and then make the template. And then you have to start using login mixin, and then everything just magically starts coming together. So let's take a look at the actual autos application. We'll look at a couple of different things here. Autos/URLs. And I'm going to do I'm going to tab so I can switch back between files really fast. You probably have a better text editor than me. So I've got URLs. I'm going to take a look at the views. Nope. Autos. Views.py. Then I'm going to look at autos model.py. Models.py. And then I'm going to look at autos forms.py. And so let's sort of work through these four files: URLs, views, models, forms. Probably let's do models first. So this is pretty straightforward. We're going to make a make object class. It's going to have one character field with some validators in it. We kind of played with that with forms. You can put validators in models. We've previously seen validators in form, but there's a validator that basically says we're not going to accept data coming into this database table unless there's at least two characters. These __str, you've been doing this for a while. That basically is if you take a model object, an actual make, and you print it, it says which of the fields, in this case there's only one field, and so that just says when we're converting a model to a string, a model object to a string, we get to decide how that looks. Okay, and then we have an automobile, and it's got a nickname.
with a min length validator, max length of 200, a mileage, which is an integer field, a comments, which is a 300 character field, and then a foreign key into, this is a one-to-many or many-to-one relationship, not a many-to-many, just a foreign key into make, and then we're going to do on delete cascade, which really means if you delete a make, then the corresponding auto entries will automatically be deleted. And so this is a pretty straightforward model, actually very, very simple. And once again, we're always defining this stir underscore underscore self so that we know that we're just, if you're just showing it like in the admin interface, or if you're just printing it, or just converting the model itself to a string, the field among these fields that is supposed to be used is the nickname field, just to show to end users. So that's the models file. Let's look at the forms file next. So the forms file is interesting because we've seen forms that are just forms by themselves, but this is a special kind of form in that it's a model form, in that we normally in the other models we had all these fields, right, and we put them in and it looked a lot like a model file where we'd have a character field, a positive integer field. But what we're basically saying is, you know what, we're going to make a form here, and really all we want to do is take all the fields from the make model and make them form fields. So a form and a model are two different things. A form is something that goes between sort of the view and the template, and it'll, as you'll see, it also goes down into the models automatically. But you gotta, so this is just like make all the fields, right? Let's make a form, because form objects don't have to be associated with models, but in this case we are going to sort of derive a form object from a model. And so instead of extending form, we're extending model form. So that's a model form must have, and this is just some data that says the model that we're going to pull all our fields from is the make model. And it only has one thing, which is a name. That's it. Okay, so this is auto-generating a form that if we changed it and added another field here, then this make form would automatically have a field. You can give it a list of fields, underscore, underscore, all, underscore, underscore, is like a signal to say, just give me all of them. Now there might be some internal things like created at or updated at, or something that you don't want to use. So that's a form. Remember how forms work. Covered that before. Let's take a look at our URLs. Now, a lot of this looks pretty similar to things that we've done, right? We basically have a main table, which is our autos table, and our lookup table, which is our makes table. And we have sort of three things. There is the main list view, which is list all the autos. There is the main the make list view, which is list all the makes. And then we can make a new one, which doesn't have a primary key, because part of the idea is the create is making a new thing, which is going to generate a primary key. And then we're going to have a update and a delete. And so we have a read, a create, update, delete. So it's not exactly CRUD, but you see all four of these things. And so we've got views, and we name these views so that we can reference them in our views themselves and in our templates, so we can make links in between them. Okay? Okay, so these are pretty straightforward and not all that different. So the fun starts to happen when we're in the views.py. So login mixin, if you remember from the auth-z walkthrough, you just add this to a view, and it just basically says you cannot get to this view unless you're logged in, and if you aren't logged in, it will bounce to the login.html file and then bounce back after you're done. And so login required mixin is all we need to do. If you go with the auth-z sample, you'll see like I did that by hand, but you don't want to do it by hand. You just call login mixin. Now, so this main view is a list view, and so let's go take a look at what this is going to look like. This is the list view. So we're going to take however many autos we have, we're going to loop through that list, we're going to retrieve all the autos from the database, then we're going to have an add the auto link, then a view the makes link with a count of how many makes there are, and add a make. So let me also then go into autos templates, autos again, yeah, I'm sorry about that, and auto list. So this is the template that makes that. And so there's a few things that we get. We get an auto list. Now the names of these are not forced upon you, but there's conventions that turn out in a moment. They're going to look really useful. Okay, so we're going to get an auto list, and if we go back into our views, we see that we say get all of the objects from the auto table, all the auto class objects, retrieve them all, pass them in to the context as auto_list. Now we also want to be able to show that little count, this number 2. So we're going to ask, go ahead to the make objects all, but don't give me a list of them, count them and give me a number. So make count is stuck in there, and you'll see if make count is greater than 0, we can show the add an auto button, and it also somewhere, shows the make count, view all the makes, add a make, and the make count comes out here. So that's another thing we put in. The auto list we're going to go through, and that iteration variable of auto is going to go through each of the separate things, and nickname, make, etc. That's right straight out of the models.py file. There's the 4 things that every auto has, and we're just printing all this stuff out. You also get the primary key, and so we're going to make a update URL, and that URL is to auto's auto update. So if we look in urls.py, we see this auto update looks up this, gives us a path to the view, but that particular path needs one parameter, which is a primary key, and so that means that this URL template tag autos has to have the auto ID. But because we're looping through the models, you got one, right? So, and you do an auto create, that's pretty straightforward, but one of the rules is you have to have at least one make before you can do an auto, because if you recall, add an auto has to have this drop down list populatable, and that's being pulled from the make table. Okay, and so that's basically the way around this. That's the main view. Now, just like I showed you before, it turns out that there are here we go. Auto create update. Yeah, that's the autos view. So, and then if we do the make view, we're doing the same kind of thing. If we go and look at the make list, we're doing the same basic kind of thing. View all the makes. This is the, and now we got update and delete. We are, this way you don't need a count. We just want to grab all of the objects. We want to put it in a context under make list, and then we do make list under HTML, and this is even simpler. It's just going through the make list. It comes in through the context. If there's none, we don't print this out, and then we put out the name of it, and then we have an update and a delete button that goes to the update and delete. And of course those, if you look in urls.py, those also, the update and delete, have primary key requirements. And so you have a primary key that you got to pass in here to make that URL the proper kind of URL. And then just some links to go back to the various things so that we can, get back to autos, view makes, add a new make, cancel, all that stuff. Okay? So that is the views.py for listing the autos and the makes. Okay? Now, we want to make the make create view. Okay? So if we take a look at the make create view, that is add a make. That's going to create this form. I can make this bigger here. Create this form where you're going to put in a thing called Chevy, BY. So we need a way to make this form, right? And so we're going to make it a login required. We're not going to let folks do this. We're going to have some variables that are class wide, like what template we want to use. And success URL is after we have done this right. Now, if you just submit it and it complains, it doesn't do it. But
once you've done it right, where do you want to go afterwards? So Chevy, where do you want to go afterwards? This is controller function. Boom, I want to go back to the auto list. And so the success URL is go to autos:all, which in urls.py is this main view. That's the name of the main view. Okay? And so if we go here, the which template to use and which success URL. If we do a GET request, we're going to build a form for the make. That comes from make form, but really it comes from the make model, which is just one string field. It's simple as that, right? We're reusing this. We're just saying let's make a form that pulls from here. We have to pass a form in because models can't be used to create this kind of a screen. That screen comes from a form, okay? And so if we take a look at the template, oops. If we look at the make create template, make form. So that is, yeah, that's the template we're going to use to make form. We're going to need form as table, right? So that's from how we did forms. Put the CSRF token, you make a table, that could be as paragraphs or as tables, but whatever, you need this form object. So you need to pass the form object in. And so here we are. We're going to make a form, and then we're going to pass the form object in, and then we're going to render it self.template, autos.makeform, HTML. And then we're going to return that for the get. And then when we hit the button, the submit button, add a make, we hit the submit button, it's going to do, it's coming into the post because we made a form post, comes in, we're going to take the, oop, don't do that, oh, that's terrible. I hate it when VI does that. But here we go, we're back. Yeah. So, post comes in, request.post has all the key value pairs, which are these key value pairs as defined by the form. So we say, let's make a make form with the initial data coming in from request post. And given that the form generated it, it knows what the names of these fields are, and this is something that hides behind how forms work. But it also checks to see if the form data is valid. And that means, were all these validator rules followed? If the validator rules are not followed, if not form is valid, we're just going to send it back. And so so this code here, this if form is not valid code, if I put in a single letter, A, and hit submit, it's going to come back and re-render the form, and all that error stuff, all that stuff is all handled by this form code. This Django form code figures out what is wrong. Right, let me move this over just a little bit so I can get back to it faster. There we go. It figures out what's wrong with it, makes an error message. The error message came from models.py right here. Oh no, right here. And then went through forms.py because it is a form ultimately that we inherited from model form. Get it? And so that's cool. So that's the error condition. And otherwise we do form.save. Now the thing here is that's really super cool is because this form is a model form. It knows, and the field names are the same as the field names in the model, and so it actually does a save on the model itself. So in a way, the form contains the model data that came from the post request, and then it saves it. Okay? That saves the form. It puts it in, and then we just redirect back to the request URL. So this is pretty succinct, right? We pull in the post data. We check to see if it's bad. If it's bad, we send it back, send the form back to the exact same template we did, and then we save it if it's good, and then we pop to the success URL. That is a beautiful thing. But just like in Django all the time, this is a far wordier thing to do, even though this is super succinct. And if you did this in almost any other language, you'd be like, 75 lines of code. And here we have like 15 lines of code. But it turns out in Django, there's almost always a more succinct way to do it. We have a generic create view. You can take a look at the documentation for this generic create view. Django views generic edit. Let's just go and Google this stuff. I always just put a dot here, and this usually gets me right to, because that's the actual package and the class inside the package. Oh no, oh no, sorry. It thought that that was a domain name, so the search didn't work. But now I'll just say, you know, Django something. Look like, so at least it's going to do the search for me. Generic editing views jump to the create view. So you can read through all this stuff, right? Generic create view. Actually, let's make a, do I have a reference to this? So there you go. Take a look at that. Now, this, just like some of the other views that we've inherited, have a ton of functionality in them. So if I want to do an auto create, this is all it takes. Now, auto create and make create, for all intents and purposes, do the exact same thing. So what happens in auto create, because we're extending create view, we have 3 bits of metadata. We tell it which model we want to use, which fields from that model we want, and where the success URL to go is. And then this generates all this code. We inherited all that code. You'll notice that there's nothing hard-coded in here except the make form. Now, we don't even have to make a form for the auto, because this code right here builds the form. And not only that, but it uses this name auto to pick the template. So if I do auto underscore form, I have to use